Welcome to the New Thinking for a New World podcast, where we explore the most pressing issues that are challenging and changing our societies. We are looking for new thinking and new solutions wherever we can find them. Listen as host Alan Stoga, the Talberg Foundation's chairman, challenges his guests for analysis, ideas and actions. Together, we can help make our world at least a bit better.
Climate change is the ultimate example of a problem that can only meaningfully be addressed at the global level. Dramatic action in a few countries may be interesting, maybe even important depending on the countries, but actually reducing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere requires many countries moving in the same direction and moving fast. Last November, most countries sent delegations, some including presidents and prime ministers, to Glasgow for the 26th United Nations high-level meeting on climate. Many saw it as an inflection point, perhaps the last real opportunity not only to deepen national commitments, but to force the kind of transformational changes in how energy is produced and consumed around the world that are necessary to hold the rise in global warming to 1.5 degrees or less. What happened? Was Glasgow a success? Did enough countries make enough commitments? More importantly, since commitments are easy, or relatively easy, is there any evidence that countries are now likely to deliver? No one is better positioned to answer those questions than Ambassador Tomas Anker Christensen, Denmark's climate ambassador. Tomas was deeply engaged in the European and global run-up to Glasgow, in the negotiations in Scotland, and in the effort since then to translate words into action. Full disclosure, Tomas served as a juror in last year's Telberg SNF Eliasson Global Leadership Prize. He is a friend of Telberg, and he's a friend of mine. Welcome, Tomas.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for having me.
Let's start where Glasgow ended. What were the most important successes and failures of COP26? 60,000-foot overview.
Well, I think the most important failure, to start with that, is that we are too far from, in the real world of action and commitments that you mentioned, we are too far from the curve that leads us to a 1.5 degree world. We went into Glasgow with being at a 2.7 degrees mark as presented by the UN, and leaving it, depending on which analysis you look at, we are somewhere in the 1.8 to 2.4 degree range. If everyone delivers on everything they promised, signed, committed to. And that's a big if. So we are still quite some way from being on track for the 1.5 degree mark. And it takes a hell of an effort by everyone to get mobilized to the extent where we were in Glasgow, where everybody was trying to be on their best behavior and actually make progress. And that's maybe part of the success of Glasgow. That when the UK took over the presidency in around this time 2 years ago, we were heading somewhere close to 4 degrees, and so even being at a 2.7 degree mark when we went into Glasgow is a considerable achievement, and mobilizing further commitments and announcements in Glasgow is also really, really great. And when Alok Sharma, the UK COP president, at the end of the COP declared success in keeping 1.5 degrees within reach, I would argue that is a fair assessment that the UK, we all collectively actually managed to do so. Now, why do I say that? That comes down to the negotiations and the outcomes that were actually negotiated in addition to the commitments in Glasgow. Success really depends on how one assesses our global collective will to act. Dag Hammarskjöld, the second UN Secretary General, famously said that the UN was not created to deliver mankind to heaven, but to save it from hell. And did the outcome of Glasgow manage to save us from hell for another day? I think it did, Alan. In the outcome, there's not only a strengthened commitment to 1.5 degrees. In Paris, we actually set 2. There is a recognition that we're far off track, that we need to reduce with 45% by 2030, which is for the first time ever a collective recognition of the size of the challenge. And there's a strong urge for everyone to either submit new plans or revisit the current plans to see if they are on track, both for 2030, but also for long-term net zero strategies for 2050. Even the concept of net zero strategies didn't exist at the UN before, and that's new as well. And the reason why it's 2.7 UN calculation and maybe 1.8 at the end of the day after Glasgow is also because there are many countries that have not submitted their plans, their NDCs, national determined contributions to the UN, including countries like India, like Russia. There are many of the large emitters in the G20 who have not done their formal paperwork yet. And the pressure is now on everyone to come back in Sharm in November of this year in Egypt and do what they have committed to in the agreement. And in the agreement, there is an annual ministerial conversation, there's an annual synthesis report, and there's a whole sort of structure now for annually reviewing and revisiting the whole regime. We didn't have that in Paris. So there's no hiding in the global eye anymore. There's a constant vigilance that governments will hold each other honest to this agreement, but also I know civil society, people like the ones who are listening to this podcast, media, everyone will focus on how well we're doing in keeping on track.
Well, let me push on that because I would argue there has not been a lot of evidence that pressure is successful. It is successful in eliciting promises. As you've just said, for the first time, 90%, we have commitments net zero from many companies, from many countries. All sorts of words are now floating around in the atmosphere. But the gap between those words and actions, if anything, seems to be wider than it was. We're in the middle of an energy crisis at the moment. Prices are very high. People are racing around looking for more coal, more oil. I would hesitate to do it, but I actually quoted Sarah Palin the other day. Burn, baby, burn seems to be the motto of the moment and couldn't be further away from the spirit of Glasgow. So the obvious question is, what is it that you felt at Glasgow that says countries, not just their climate ambassadors, but actually the people making political decisions, are willing to this time to walk the walk?
Alan, there was no one, and heads of government who were there in the first 3 days, and all their ministers, and these are not only climate envoys, but also energy ministers and everyone else. There was no one who was questioning the urgency of the situation, the need to act, and the need to accelerate action, including energy transition. There are many reasons for the current energy crisis, but to claim that it's related to the rollout of renewable energy is pretty ludicrous. And I mean, the fact that there are some powers who are limiting their gas exports and are whipping up a crisis doesn't mean that the energy transition is not picking up speed. This is a short-term blip that's also caused by extra demand for energy coming out of the COVID crisis and very rapid global growth.
But let me push on that. But Tomas, let me push back there because I think there is considerable evidence that there has been, and it's been engineered deliberately, a shortfall in investment in new hydrocarbon resources.
Absolutely.
The gap, depending on how you measure it, is large and getting larger between what is needed to sustain in the next 5 years, 10 years, hydrocarbon, oil and gas, even coal production, and what companies and countries are actually doing. So it is more than just the recovery from the pandemic, and it is more than just the pace at which renewables are rolling out. We are systematically pressing down the production of hydrocarbons, and it shouldn't have been a surprise that the result is higher energy prices and that gap that in the short run could be incredibly politically dangerous because politicians could be more willing to react to voters who are angry about high electricity prices in Europe or elsewhere, and forget the long run needs to make this transformation.
But Alan, the solution to that crisis is not to say that the rollout of renewables is failing. It is to double the efforts to increase the pace of the energy transition. That's what we're doing in Denmark, and I think that's what's going to happen in Europe as a consequence of the crisis. And traveling in the Middle East, I think listening to what's happening in North Africa and the Gulf, they are also not only focusing on their hydrocarbon exports, but also looking at investing more and at higher speed into renewables to create new markets and new export commodities. There's a lot of talk about green hydrogen and the way the hydrogen revolution will help decarbonize industry and the hard-to-abate sectors and transport, by the way, but also of energy and energy interconnectors. We are in my part of Europe, Northern Europe, looking at a very rapid scale up of offshore wind in the North Sea, just as you are on the U.S. East Coast, and similarly in other parts of Europe and North Africa, they're looking at rapid build out of solar, and I think that's a question of time before that kicks in and starts replacing the energy that, as you rightly say, where investments are no longer coming. And clearly, there is a transition period. It is not a straight line from one energy system to the other. It's bumpy. It's messy. It goes up and down. Prices will be volatile. But that's also due to the fact that there's no global government, there's no global planning agency. It's very much building on the forces of the market, right? And there's some adjustments in the market that simply haven't taken place yet.
Let me follow that with first a top-down and then a bottom-up question. The top-down question you just alluded to. Collaborative global action requires, collaboration. It's the nature. How possible is that at a time of growing geopolitical tension?
I would say that actually there was much less tension in Glasgow than I've seen previously. And again, the collective agreement on the challenge, on the severity of the situation that we're facing as a global community was much stronger than I've seen before. No one was questioning that. No one was questioning the science. No one was questioning the need to act and to act at speed. I think what most governments are grappling with now is more the how. How do you manage the energy transition when most of your engineers know how to operate a coal power station or to drill for oil and gas, but very few know how to operate a wind farm or a solar farm or build the intermittency and the energy system based where you use renewable energy as a base load instead of nuclear or coal or gas. I mean, these are hard engineering questions that many countries don't have the expertise in yet, and to build that at speed and scale is necessary. I would also say that in the financial sector, there are many financial operators who simply don't understand this fully yet and haven't grasped onto it. The multilateral development banks need a makeover. I listened to a conversation yesterday where Mark Carney, the special envoy for finance of the UN Secretary General, former central bank governor of the UK, was arguing that we need to totally reform the MDBs to to use their balance sheets to, help speed up the transition. There are many pieces of the international architecture that still haven't come around to facilitating and doing this. Carney, he gathered $130 trillion in his net zero finance alliance, but that money has to come out and work, and that takes a lot of hard work, country by country, sector by sector. And I sensed in Glasgow a lot of willingness, even amongst the largest economies, also the carbohydrate producers in the global south, to do this. But we still don't have enough experts, enough infrastructure, enough knowledge of how to do it. That's the big bottleneck right now.
If you feel that the world lacks global leaders, please help support the Thalberg Foundation programs. Individual donations are being accepted at thalbergfoundation.org/donate. That's TALLBERG foundation.org/donate.
The bottom-up question maybe points to another bottleneck in a sense. It's one thing at the global or national level for leaders to make commitments to net zero, to talk about speeding them up as the EU has consistently tried to move its objectives nearer in time. It's quite another to execute in democratic societies. You need people, voters, to accept that these kinds of fundamental changes in how they live are necessary. Is there enough work being done? And this is an impossible question to answer, but at that grassroots level, at the level of getting actual people, not leaders, people, to do what needs to get done, to accept the changes that they are going to have to live fundamentally differently, or is there a gap? Is part of the gap between promise and action the fact that we're a little short on the democratic leadership side?
But Alan, I think I would frame this differently, though. I would say that most people are very happy to be part of this transition on the premise that they can continue living as they have done until now. 15 years.
Fair enough, but that premise is a false premise.
It's not.
So when you increase electricity prices in Spain by 100% in 12 months.
15 years ago, all of us had fixed phones. How many people have a fixed phone in their home today? I don't. I haven't had one for 12 years.
That was a voluntary choice, and you got better performance out of it.
15 years ago, everybody had cable. Now you're streaming all your news. You're watching your shows on Netflix.
That's a European phenomenon, and that is a very specific phenomenon in Europe. It's not true in the global South. It's not true in China. It's not true in America. So is it the case that if you increase electricity prices by 100, 200, 300%, which means you're going to spend on electricity and not on other things, if you quadruple or more the price of transportation, this transition, I was trained as an economist, and the worst problem with how economists think is that they assume transition's away. Oh, yes, here's where we're going, here's where we are. Don't worry what happens in between. Isn't that the greatest risk, that people just say no?
My point is that renewable energy per kilowatt hour installed is much cheaper than fossil-generated energy. So if people can drive an electric car instead of a combustion engine car, and it's better for the environment, and they can get the car at the same price, and the energy that they put into it is cheaper than the gas, they'll do it.
It's the transition I'm asking about.
Right.
Because you don't get to that transition unless people are willing to pay the cost of the transition.
But for the consumer, the choice, if the energy, electricity you get out of your socket, I mean, do you ever think about whether it comes from nuclear or from a coal power station or gas station or from a wind farm? Most people.
I actually do, because I'm given the option of different packages of energy that I can purchase.
But for most people, it's the fact that they have electricity that matters, not the source of it.
For most people, it's the fact of and the price of. Price matters.
Right.
And this is systematically got to. It's how economics work. We're trying to raise prices to discourage consumption. That's supply and demand. But voters have a bad habit of saying, excuse me, inflation is going up. I'm unhappy. I'm going to vote these guys out in hoping that something else happens. I'm not saying it's a rational long term. How do we're telling people what they have to do. I don't know that we've brought them along. It is different in some European countries for sure, where there's a much more robust and open conversation about the energy transformation. I worry that leaders are committing things that their followers don't quite understand.
But that's based on the premise that you can continue business as usual at no cost and at no political cost either, and that's not viable either. If we do nothing about climate change, the cost of our current life form will become much higher, and the insecurity will become much higher. So status quo is not an option either. And I think people are realizing that both in Europe and in North America with the severe storms, the heat waves, the cold waves, the floods. That standing still is not viable either. And you're right that in a transition there is volatility and prices go up and down, but eventually the renewable energy alternatives to the current energy systems are cheaper and as operative and stable. And in that sense, I think that the biggest challenge to people's life form and lifestyle is actually more in the food side of things. Beef and grass-fed animals on food that comes on four legs is much more energy intensive and emission high than other food sources. And in terms of people's diet, that's probably where the biggest challenge is.
Well, let's talk about that, because one of the new commitments in Glasgow was, in fact, the commitment by more than 100 countries to cut emissions from methane by 30% by the end of the decade.
Right.
And that doesn't mean anything to anybody until you explain that one of the largest sources of methane is, in fact, agriculture.
Yes.
And is, in fact, those four-legged animals that McDonald's makes available in patty form. The problem, of course, is that agriculture in Europe, in the United States, in most countries, is incredibly political. We all have, certainly in the industrial world, stupid agricultural policies based on at least rational economics, but they're based on very rational politics. So to your point, that is one of those commitments that is mission critical.
It is, and the Global Energy Transition Commission, which does some of the best analysis of the energy space, they, in their report coming into Glasgow, were saying that the cutting down of methane by 40% in 2030 is the most effective way of ensuring that we're on a 1.5 degree track. So the 30% reduction commitment that more than 100 nations did is not even enough in terms of what the expert says we should be doing. And the main sources of methane currently are, animals, oil and gas production, and waste. But there's a fourth source that hasn't really been released yet, but that's all the methane that's trapped in the permafrost and under the ice in the high north, in the Arctic. And as the Arctic is melting, we will see burps of methane being released from Siberia, from the ocean floor in the Arctic, and the experts fear that methane coming from there might actually be what drives the climate change even faster than we're currently seeing. In terms of our cows and what comes out of both ends of them, to my knowledge, not sufficient research has been invested into that challenge. We've been looking so much at energy system transformation, increasingly at transport and industry transformation. We've been focusing on tree planting in terms of sequestering carbon. farm animals and their emissions has not been a focus of major global initiatives yet. There are many people who now, with that pledge from Glasgow, are looking at this, and I think human ingenuity and researchers and getting everybody focused on it might actually help deliver results. And so I know that in Europe, at least, we're more focused on energy system transformation in the short run, and then looking at agriculture coming after that. I have seen people arguing, especially my friends from hydrocarbon producing countries in the Gulf, saying, well, I mean, we could start looking at your animals first and then look at our sources of emissions afterwards. And I'm sure that, I mean, that's a conversation we haven't really had yet. What are the trade-offs, and where do you get more bang for the buck first, and what do we need to move on first in order to be on track? And that's also where we come back to the question of the collective global will. How do we construct inside the negotiations and outside those alliances between North and South, large and small, that makes everybody feel part of moving along? And I mean, a lot of what we've talked about now, Alan, is more economics and the way sort of the public and private work together on making systems change. And you could say, why do you even need a global circus every year where negotiators sit down and agree on words? I think you do it because it's by having the global conversation that we also collectively all move in that same direction and get to understandings about how we organize our energy systems, our agricultural systems, and so on. And more and more, you will see these kinds of plurilateral agreements like the methane one, that sort of the front runners taking a decision, taking a leadership role, and then everybody following suit. And that also keeps bringing new technologies into the marketplace, bringing prices down, and spurring everybody along. We talked about electrification of transport and cars. 5 years ago, no one thought that even would be an issue that would move at any speed. And now you have a large number of countries and of vehicle producers setting targets for ending combustion engine by 2030 or 2035. And I can see in my own country, we've gone from zero EVs and hybrids to a third of all cars sold last year were EVs, and more than half were EVs or hybrids. And the charging companies are now doubling, tripling, quadrupling their efforts to get the charging infrastructure in place, because consumers are actually ahead of the charging and industry. And we're also making catch up in terms of ensuring that we have the green energy supply to feed the energy into those cars so that they don't run on German produced coal generated energy.
It's not possible to have this or to finish this conversation without introducing another C word, which is China. I think it's true that there's no path that excludes dramatic action by China, but demand for oil from China has yet to peak. They continue to open new coal plants. President Xi was noticeable by his absence from Glasgow. China's climate diplomats had a bit of a rough road there. They were behind the curve, dramatically so. At the same time, the irony is that they are a leading producer of solar and other renewable technologies, so they're working on both sides of the balance sheet. Can we get to where we, the world, needs to get to without China behaving fundamentally differently than they have been?
We can't get to where we need to be without China stepping up its acts. That's true. If you look at global emissions, roughly 1/3 now come from the OECD, Europe, US, Australia combined, and Canada and so on. Roughly 1/3, a little less than 1/3 from China, and roughly 1/3 from the rest of the world. So China in and by itself is such a large piece of the challenge and of the solution. The Chinese leadership has committed to peaking emissions before 2030 and it seems as if they will start a coal phase out and phase down by 2026. Hopefully they can advance that date. That's where all eyes will be upon them. And I think the mechanism introduced in Glasgow, where we have to revisit and review and have ministerial level engagement on mitigation and the 1.5 challenge every year, will also put China on the spot every year to come back and tell the world what they have done. And I think that kind of mechanism will make everybody more focused on actually delivering. In that sense, the Chinese in Glasgow in the final round, I think felt quite isolated. And it wasn't just the US and Europe who were saying, you need to step up your action, but there was a chorus of voices from small island states that are disappearing, from vulnerable countries where the seawater is rising, from countries in Africa and Latin America, developing countries who were saying enough is enough. We need to end emissions from coal. All the major emitters need to start reducing their emissions, and that was a clear message to China from the countries they've been working the closest with in the global south. So,
but what is it?
The pressure is on.
The pressure's on, but is there evidence the Chinese care about that pressure? Pressure is in the eye of the beholder, and those who are pushing think they're pushing. Why do we think that the Chinese are listening and are actually rethinking their strategies?
Well, that's where I think that even though China has isolated itself with the pandemic, China is still very much a part of global value chains and global markets, and you can see consumers all over the West and the world starting to demand more green products, starting to be much more conscious about the way things are produced and where they come from. And there's a lot of pressure on China to clean up its act. And let me quote one piece of evidence for you. There's in the shipping world, the Danish company Maersk is probably the largest container shipping company around. And they set themselves the target of decarbonizing their shipping by 2050 as a leader in the shipping business. And the demand for green shipping on them from the consumer good producers, the Nikes or Ikeas of the world, is so large that they have increased their order of green ships, and they have advanced the date for being net zero to 2040. And I think there are many companies that are experiencing this kind of demand and are pushing that down their value chain. That also means that all the products that they transport that come from the Far East, including from China, the producers of those goods are now demanding that they be produced using green energy, clean water, sustainable circumstances. And that pressure is definitely on China and on other countries in Asia. I think Indonesia feels the same, Vietnam, Korea, even Japan, all those countries that are factories of the world.
I hope that's true. I have to say I see very little evidence in changes in how China is actually being run, what it's actually doing. There isn't even much lip service being paid, but we'll see. But Tomas, let me thank you for this conversation and also for your efforts, because I know you have had, weeks, months, years of sleepless nights trying to move this transition. And if it weren't for people like you, we would not be where we are, which is maybe not where we need to be, but is a hell of a lot better place than would otherwise be the case absent the effort. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. I have the honor and pleasure to work for a government and a country that is still fastly dedicated to this cause, and hence it's fairly easy for me to implement what the collective will of my small polity is. Thanks.
Thanks again.
Thank you for joining us. Please rate our show on Apple Podcast and subscribe. Meanwhile, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, or you can subscribe to our newsletter at tallbergfoundation.org to learn more about our work. That's TALLBERG foundation.org. Thank you, and we'll be back again next week for another episode of Tallberg's New Thinking for a New World. This podcast was brought to you through the generous support of SNF, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation.